I think a lot of it is, particularly in the mainstream media, is often kind of very fear-driven headlines. So we tend to focus on the good, right? So what is it that you can really deliver in terms of, like, for example, improved outcomes for kids? That's using AI for a really, really good purpose.
This episode of the EdTech Startup Show is brought to you by EduHustles. That's www.eduhustles.com. EduHustles is a place where teachers can go to find out about part-time education-related side hustles that they can do using their existing skills and experience. And over my about 10 years of teaching, I've done every education-related side hustle, from running a club to tutoring to working for an online teaching company to doing consulting, blogging, freelancing. And I realized that lots of other teachers were looking for these same kinds of opportunities and also looking to learn about how to get started with this stuff. So if you are an educator, an administrator even, or just curious to see what it's all about, go to www.eduhustles.com, drop your email in there, and introduce yourself when you get the message from me. Also, if you're an education company and you want to talk to me about hiring teachers for education-related part-time jobs, you can reach out to me at gerard@gerarddawson.com. Today's episode is also brought to you by the 5-Day Copy Fix. I've been a teacher for about 10 years, as I've mentioned, and I've helped, fortunately, some of the bigger K-12 EdTech companies in America fix their website, emails, content, case studies, etc. by doing one thing, and that's improving the copy. After thinking about what I've learned, mistakes I've made, different techniques and tactics and strategies I've tried, I put it all together for you. And for you, I'm talking about folks working in marketing or founders of education companies or EdTech startups, or even a solo education consultant. And I put it together for you in a short 5-day free email course, which, like I mentioned, is called the 5-Day Copy Fix. Now, it's not a magic bullet. It's not going to magically transform your business. However, if you read the 5 lessons, think carefully about how they apply to your specific business situation, and most importantly, apply the ideas, I think you'll see some surprising improvements. So if you're curious to see what it's all about, go to gerarddawson.com, and right on the front page there, you'll see a form to drop in your email and get lesson 1. So put in your email, hit the big button, and once you get that first lesson, please hit reply, introduce yourself, and let me know what you think. You're listening to the EdTech Startup Show, and I'm your host, Gerard Dawson. Today, my guest is Martyn Farrows, the COO of SoapBox Labs, based in Ireland. Martyn, thanks for coming on the show.
Pleasure to be here, Gerard.
So just to give a little context for your company, SoapBox Labs is an award-winning voice technology company specializing in the development of automated speech recognition for kids. So voice tech, which is kind of a quickly growing area of EdTech right now. So can you, if people ask you, what does SoapBox Labs do in your words, how do you describe what the company does?
Sure. Well, we normally start off by describing, what we build, which is speech technology for children, and we've been laser focused on that for 7 years now. We really focus very specifically on young children, so kids from roughly speaking, 2 to 12 years of age. You can get some very articulate 2-year-olds who are able to use speech technology. We started off saying 4-year-olds, but it's slowly moving down the age scale as we realize kids are becoming much more articulate. But that's what we do. And we work in a number of different markets, education being our biggest and most important, and the one where we started. And it's probably the one where we have the most passion. We also do a lot of work in areas like English language learning and increasingly in consumer markets. So, as you rightly say, as voice has really exploded over the last 5 or 6 years with the adoption of things like smart assistants in the home, people have really started to kind of cotton on to the idea that voice as an interface can be a really powerful tool for how we interact with technology in multiple different scenarios. And as much as that is applicable to adults, of course, kids make up a pretty large portion of the global population. So kids are going to need to be able to use their voice in using technology as well. And that's really our domain. That's where we are the experts. We've been doing this for a long time now. And I'm very happy to say that we're market leaders and, as you say, award winners in this space.
Right. Thank you for the additional context there. And before we jump into a few other questions that I've prepared for you here, one thing you mentioned there is, saying being focused on serving, children and learning in particular. And I remember hearing you describe in a previous talk about how, I forget your precise wording, but about how voice is kind of the most intuitive or natural way to interact with technology. So it seems to me how voice tech is almost, best suited for kids, or might be the best way for kids to interact with technology. Can you talk a little bit about that, about why voice technology is appropriate and so appropriate for kids in particular?
Yeah, sure. I think voice generally is a very natural interface for us. As adults, we probably have a little bit more of a hang up though when we're using technology and using our voice. Number one, because we probably understand a little bit more that it has shortcomings, and our experience of it, certainly up until very recently, wouldn't have been great. And secondly, we may be a little bit more self-aware. We kind of feel a little bit awkward about using a voice to talk to what we know is an inanimate object, right? In many cases. Whereas kids, they love the idea of using their voice. I mean, they use and they verbalize at a very early age. And when we have kids, we're trying to get them to speak. And when they say their first word, you're kind of capturing it for family and so on. And so for them, from very early on, language acquisition and communicating using language is very natural for them. It's a very natural thing for them to do. So, and then when it comes to working with technology, particularly if they've been introduced to it quite early on, they don't have the same barriers to using voice with technology. And they expect it to work also naturally. They expect it to be able to, handle all of the idiosyncrasies that they may have when they're using language. But it's really, it gives them independence. They feel like they can use their voice to interact with technology. It gives them agency, particularly when it's involved in an educational context and teaching. It allows them to practice at their own pace. They don't necessarily need to have access to an adult, a helpful adult. And in many cases, from an equity point of view, they may not have access to a helpful adult that can help with their education journey. So there's lots of reasons why kids are really natural users of their voice when it comes to interacting with technology and generally, but also as part of their kind of education and language acquisition journey.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So moving ahead now from, children and education to the movie Pulp Fiction. Again, when listening to you speak, talking about your role at the company, you said you're a mixture of two characters, Winston the cleaner wolf from Pulp Fiction, if anyone's familiar with that, and Winnie the Pooh, I believe you said. Why do you use that comparison for your work at SoapBox Labs?
Yeah, you're right. I did use that comparison. It was a couple of years ago now when we were a little bit of an earlier stage business than we are now. We were less mature, I guess, in some ways, and we were a smaller team. And then, typically the role of COO in a team like that is to deal with a whole wide range of issues and problems that often happen in the background, and are often a sort of cleaned up and tidied up in a way that nobody ever sees. So that was the Winston Wolfe reference as a character that I'm very fond memories of from the movie. And then Winnie the Pooh is more to do with the fact that most of what I do and a lot of our role is building relationships, right? And building and finding connections, right? And anybody who's familiar with the Winnie the Pooh stories will know that he's a very amiable and kind of empathetic character. And I think that a lot of my role is around empathy and building relationships. So maybe not an obvious combination, but Winston the Wolf and Winnie the Pooh it is.
Sure. Yeah, there's certainly power in contrast, so that sticks in the,
that's for sure. Yeah.
In the mind. So you're hinting a little bit there that perhaps your role has evolved in this period of growth. So is there, I won't put you on the spot and ask you for two new characters, but in terms of your focus, are there ways that, or how have you seen your role evolve as the company has grown?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think, Jared, we're really lucky to have been able to pull together an amazing team of talented people. We'll be close to just over 30 people within the next couple of months. The team has grown from kind of less than 10 a couple of years ago. So, you can see a fairly big growth trajectory for us. And when that happens, you bring expertise into the business that allows you to focus on very specific roles. So as businesses grow, possibly role definition becomes more pronounced. We are very lucky that we have over 100 years of accumulated voice experience around kids. I myself have over 20 years experience of working with education technology. And so really my role now is much more about focusing on relationships and partnerships and building out the business from a revenue point of view, but also from a point of view of a global growth trajectory. And that's really the exciting stage that we're at now in terms of scaling up and really, growing and taking advantage of all of the really good work that we've done over the last 7 years in terms of building the technology and the platform that we have.
Yeah, and so you use those words, relationships and partnerships, which leads me to ask about your company as providing sort of a service to other companies through your technology. And so many of our listeners are either entrepreneurs or educators, but may not be technological experts, especially when it comes to voice tech. Can you talk a little bit about SoapBox Labs as an API company and how you interact with other companies?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we're very much an enabling technology in the background, right? So what we do is we integrate our platform into either new or existing products or suites of products that our partners will be offering to the market. And we voice enable that to allow, in some cases, the expressive voice of the child to be used as part of their assessment journey, or the voice of the child to be used in a therapeutic context where it's to do with speech therapy, or where it's to do with increasing engagement levels and the experience for the child where it's a consumer product, like a robot or a smart toy. So it's very much about things like, voice enablement, but as an add-on and as a value add to bring a product or a suite of products to the next level in terms of allowing the child to use their voice to interact. So, often we'll have companies working with us on parallel tracks. So they might use, our voice experience and a non-voice enabled experience as a kind of hybrid solution. It's generally, a component of a product that's brought to market, but we're very much the kind of almost the Intel inside of voice tech for kids. That's how we like to be seen. And our mission really is to get voice technology to be a kind of a ubiquitous technology for kids, but that's done in a way that, number one, is incredibly accurate, and so therefore the kids get the benefit of the utility of the technology, but also that respects their fundamental rights to digital privacy. And those are two really important tenets that we operate in terms of a business.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I want to come back to digital privacy as you've mentioned there. to build on a little bit about how you're explaining your work with other companies, I suggest people who are listening who want to see kind of a very quick but powerful demonstration on your website. You have that small interactive piece where people can select a sentence. I think it says the horse runs fast, and then see how your technology breaks it down into the individual phonemes of each individual sound. So I just encourage listeners to go to the SoapBox Labs website so they can see how that at least one piece of how the technology works.
Yeah, that's incredibly powerful. That just that visualization of how you can perform pronunciation assessment at that really granular level. So as you say, at a phoneme level, we can report back on how well a child is pronouncing a word. And that's just one of the many use cases that we have for voice technology. But you're absolutely right. It's a really powerful visual in terms of the granular level of detail that we can get to because of the accuracy and the robustness of the system that we provide.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is sort of a new area, right? Because even if we're using things like the Google Home or Facebook Portal or Alexa or Siri or whatever, we're not as familiar with there's not as many, perhaps I should say, voice-enabled technologies, or at least it feels that way. But again, a lot of listeners are curious to learn. They're involved in education. So I'm wondering, as you've learned about this space, if there's basically any recommendations you can have for people who want to learn about voice and AI in education, whether that's people or books, resources, events, anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a whole lot of stuff out there at the moment in terms of really understanding what AI can do. I think a lot of it is, particularly in the mainstream media, is often kind of very fear-driven headlines. So we tend to focus on the good, right? So what is it that you can really deliver in terms of, like, for example, improved outcomes for kids? That's using AI for a really, really good purpose. I mean, I certainly find the most valuable readings, particularly in education. You can go to things like EdSearch and EdSurge, rather, and EdWeek, the Heshinger report. They're all good publications that cover AI and in education to some degree. But if you're really kind of looking at how we use AI in education and AI more broadly around improving outcomes for kids, then there is an anthropologist called Veronica Barassi who does a lot of work around ethics and technology and kids. She has a project called Child Data Citizen. If you search Child Data Citizen, you'll get access to that project. She's now based in Switzerland, but is really at the forefront of looking at how we use AI and how we take a very ethical approach to using AI, particularly with kids. And then more broadly, there's people like Lex Friedman, MIT, who has a great set of podcasts online. He has a whole bunch of experts coming in and talking about different aspects of AI in different walks of life and how that can impact us in the future. So those are the kind of key areas that I tend to focus on when I'm looking for more information about how we can effectively use this technology to support kids.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So yeah, I'll link to those both when we publish the episode and in the show notes. So you mentioned earlier, there's you can integrate voice technology into things like robots and toys. And I know I've especially recently seen some cool advertisements basically showcasing what's possible there. I think they're really doing a good job of kind of humanizing it and making, because it does, as you mentioned, the media can present it through this lens of fear, but I think there is so much good to be done when it comes to helping kids to learn and interact through voice. So from your perspective, as somebody who has a high level view of seeing how all these partners of SoapBox are building things, can you give a little overview of kind of like what you see in terms of what's possible now with voice technology in education, and then maybe even if it's a little bit of a prediction, where you think things are headed going forward?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, the obvious ones are, and the place where most people start is a kind of smart assistant and, using a smart assistant in the classroom, right? But then when you think about that a little bit more, a smart assistant is really just a very narrow use case for voice technology. And with kids, we're very fortunate to work with some amazing people who allow us to uncover the many use cases that apply for kids. And the great thing about, working with kids is that, a 3 or 4-year-old will have very different use cases and requirements than a 7 or 8-year-old, right? So you're building not for a kind of homogenous group of or cohort of kids, but for, a very heterogeneous group. So we work, the obvious use cases are things like English language learning. So kids who are learning to speak English as a second language, even at a very young age. We have kids on our platform through our partners, Lingumi, who are, there's 2 and 3-year-old kids in Taiwan who are learning to speak English using the Lingumi platform, but voice enabled by SoapBox Labs. Then you move into areas like speech therapy, where you have kids who have kind of speech and difficulties where they may not have access to a speech therapist as much as they would like, or as much as the speech therapist would like, and they can use the technology to go home and practice the things that the speech therapist has been asking them to do, and then those results can be reported back to the speech therapist, so the next time they see them, they've got an update in terms of progress, in terms of the practice they've been doing. You have things like diagnostic tools like dyslexia screeners. So, some great research going on in the US at the moment around, how you can identify, even in pre-literate children, the markers or indicators of potential future reading difficulties. And you can use speech technology to help inform that. Florida Centre for Reading Research and Yakov Pecha are doing some amazing work down there as part of the Reach Every Reader project. And also looking at, bias and in terms of assessing kids, and human bias when they're assessing kids who have maybe certain dialects or accents, which may have a negative impact in terms of how they're assessed in terms of fluency, but actually in terms of their literacy levels, they should not be brought into the equation. There are other things that we deal with. For example, we deal with everything in terms of literacy, from phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, blending, decoding, right up to reading fluency. So there's such a wide variety of application areas and use cases, just even in education, that we're only just scratching the surface with. And like I say, we're extremely fortunate to be working with some amazing partners to develop new products that are becoming into the market in fall of this year and of next year. I think to come back to your question in terms of, what's next, I think the last 3 months has taught us a lot about, the kind of supports that we're going to need for kids in terms of remote learning. And, I think speech technology can play an amazing role in terms of supporting educators and parents in the home, where they might not have direct contact time with the teacher, but they can use, curriculum approaches that are voice enabled by our technology to help to improve outcomes and maintain, levels of education that would not ordinarily be possible remotely. So there's a lot of exciting things happening, and I certainly think that, for us, even the last 3 months has been, quite an incredible learning journey in terms of just what it takes to support kids who are remote learning.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah. As you're highlighting the various use cases, you can see really where it's, not to oversimplify it, but whenever kids are speaking or need to speak as part of their education, that's where voice technology is able to at least lend some sort of hand. So I remember, just as a quick anecdote, where I started to notice some of the power of it, even though I teach high school, is you mentioned basically issues of equity or bias. I forget your exact wording, but there's a gentleman named Jamie Poskin in the Bay Area who's building something called TeachFX, which basically the simple way to describe it is you turn on your smartphone and it will record the teacher in the class and then provide analysis of which students are speaking most often, who's asking the questions, the teacher or the student. And I remember seeing, the report from the class and just noticing how powerful it was to have this app that was able to recognize our speech and provide insights almost instantaneously.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. It's such a powerful tool and such a simple tool when you think about the implementation of it. And I think that's the key as well. In education, particularly, we possibly in the past have of overcomplicated solutions, or even not thought too carefully, or not carefully enough about, the needs of the students and the teachers. It's often been, systems that are built really to support teaching as opposed to learning, right? And I think that the examples exactly like the one you just described are going to be more prevalent going forwards, but also with a focus very much more on supporting the needs of individual learners.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So you're mentioning here now the focus on the learners, and part of the way to enable that is that educators, whether it's teachers or school leaders, as well as parents, and also education companies, need to do the hard work of learning about potentially how to use voice technology, and for companies perhaps look for where they can use voice technology to reach learners to more where they are, or to reach learners in a way that's more helpful to them. So how do you think educators and education companies can adapt to this, to basically best take advantage of voice in education?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is about just exploring use cases and being open-minded enough to rethink how we deliver solutions, bearing in mind that now we have this additional kind of tool in the box, right? It's almost like there's something now that we never had access to before, but certainly at a level of accuracy that we can deliver. And it's about thinking creatively about, well, how can we use that to improve outcomes for kids, right? So, having a solution that's built to understand kids while they're reading or speaking out loud and scoring those utterances, right? So that's a really powerful use case, a really simple use case, but a really powerful use case. And then being able to use that information, those data points, as it were, to design more effective interventions from an instructional point of view for that individual child, right? Almost on the fly, right? So you can very clearly tailor and level the curriculum content, the curriculum resources based on the data that the speech technology is delivering from the utterances that the child is delivering. And the key thing here is that you can do that in a really sensitive way, right? So whilst you may be surfacing information to the child, which is designed to encourage them to keep going, to keep practicing, to keep moving through, you're actually delivering a different set of data points back to the teacher that's helping them in a diagnostic sense to understand, well, where is it this child is having either pronunciation difficulties or reading fluency difficulties. And so those things are really powerful tools that I think can help to enable and empower teachers to maximize the very valuable time that they have during the day in terms of spending with the kids themselves, right? So we all know, I mean, I see it with my kids that, that particularly when they're at that early literacy level, that they will only get so much contact time one-on-one with the teacher, because there's a class of 30 kids and the school day is relatively short when you're trying to cover an entire curriculum. But if you can help that process along by informing in a structured and valuable way using technologies such as speech technology, you can really help to improve outcomes for the kids themselves.
Mm-hmm. And so, as you're describing this process of how the teacher can kind of best leverage voice technology or speech technology, I'm wondering to what extent you and your colleagues have seen interesting things in the data of how your API is used. I guess first I'll just leave it broadly like that. Have you had any interesting insights or observations as you see how the technology is being used through your partners?
Yeah, a couple of really good recent examples. Well, one which is a general point, which is, and something which is obvious now that we say it, but at the time, the power of it didn't really hit home, is just the ability or the impact that it has on kids when they listen back to themselves, right? In terms of the feedback loop, right? I remember as a kid, the first time you record yourself on a cassette tape, right? And then you listen back to it and you're kind of like, well, first of all, that doesn't sound anything like me, but it's really interesting to hear what my voice sounds like. But for kids, when you observe them, even in an educational context, even if they're playing a kind of educational game of some sort around spelling, for them to be able to listen back to themselves is such a rewarding feedback loop in terms of the kind of educational process. That voice, it's almost like a secondary factor, but it's, being able to listen back as part of that voice experience has been really, really, really valuable. The second one, I think, is just in terms of engagement, right? I mean, I think, we found with our partners that they were blown away by how much the kids wanted to engage with the curriculum content when they could start using their voice, right? So, they really increased the engagement levels with the material. And therefore, you see an acceleration in terms of development and progress through the material because the kids are so much more engaged. And there's lots of research to show about, how engagement drives improved learning outcomes. And then more recently, particularly with the situation around COVID-19, we've seen, massive spikes in terms of usage because kids are at home, right? So we've had customers who have 600, 700% increases in terms of kids accessing and using the technology. So, lots of really interesting developments going on, some of which are, kind of accidental, particularly the listening back one. But when you see it, you realize, well, that's just such an obvious feedback loop for the kids.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I can, language learning or fluency, once you hear your own mistakes or your own improvements, goes a long way. What about in terms of devices? I, of course, immediately think of the assistants, as you've mentioned, but do you have any insights as to on what devices these types of learning activities are most often occurring?
Yeah, I think, in our experience, they're mostly devices which have a screen component, because the visual element is really important for the kids, not just in terms of engagement, but also feedback, right? So, particularly with young kids, their ability to talk to a character even, to have some kind of character on the screen that they're able to interact with. A piece of plastic sitting on a desk with no screen is not particularly engaging experience for a kid, even if you put a bright colored ring around it. It's still not a particularly engaging experience. And so screens, do seem to be important, but not to the extent that the kids are, wholly focused on the screen. So, screen time is a big factor these days, particularly with young kids. So just, a kind of almost like secondary visual prompt is important to them, as opposed to be reading content on the screen. So that's one of the big, I guess, trends that we see, that, mobile phones, tablet devices, and increasingly in the market now we're seeing, products that are designed and built for kids, or like robots, educational robots that have a screen on them, that have some voice interaction, but are very much driven around a kind of STEM type subject matter. Those are the big growth areas, particularly as, hardware components, the cost of hardware components comes down. You start to see a lot more adoption in terms of the technology at that level.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and as you're giving the overview of the various devices, I'm thinking about how now one advantage of all of these devices being voice enabled now is that it's basically an assumption for kids, once they get exposed to it, that the technology will be voice enabled. So I feel like that will help to speed up adoption.
Oh, totally. I mean, it's exactly the same as happened, once when the iPhone first came out and iPads, and kids started using them, that they just assumed that every screen was a touch screen and they could swipe. Right now, it's, every piece of technology is voice enabled. My kids won't search for anything on the TV unless they can use their voice. They're not going to, use the remote control to try to type in the name of the TV show they want to watch. They just expect to be able to use their voice. Same in the car, they want to be able to interact, and it's fun for them, right? And it's that's the whole point, is that you can make it a fun experience for them whilst also having an education experience. But you're absolutely right. There is a kind of like a set of kind of voice natives that are coming through now, that will just assume that everything in the home is going to be voice enabled and voice controlled.
Mm-hmm. Though I will add, Martyn, there are a few things more frustrating that when I find myself in an argument between me, my son, and an electronic device over what song to play or what show to play, that shows the democratizing power effect almost of the voice technology.
I'm totally with you on that one. You lose complete control of your entire music library once the kids figure out how to use it. Totally, yeah. But then you have to educate them and bring them on a journey of education around music, and introduce them to different types of music, and maybe some of that will stick.
Good point. Yeah. So anyway, you mentioned earlier about your company's importance and focus on privacy, and especially around children and data related to children using technology. And anyone who's used an EdTech product or has built one knows that fortunately there is more and more legislation mandating that companies are careful with children's data, but especially with voice, because of the more or less the listening aspect of the devices, people do have somewhat of a paranoia around it. So what do you say in response to that? You touched on it a little bit earlier, but just to address it directly, how does your company think about privacy?
So I think you're absolutely right in terms of the legislative framework, and we certainly welcome, greater legislative and regulatory efforts to control access to data around education specifically, but more broadly with kids who are using technology. We're very fortunate in the US. We have COPPA in the European Union now. We have GDPR, which has very specific provisions around kids. We as a business kind of always, and from the very beginning, took a view that we would be privacy by design from the outset. So in other words, that we would take proactive measures never to identify the identity of an individual child, which is kind of counterintuitive, as particularly for a lot of people who are used to using consumer brands as an adult, because there's almost a compromise that you make when you use that technology, that you are giving away some of your rights to data privacy. So we've taken the entirely opposite approach, that we say, right, okay, we take no efforts and make no efforts to identify the individual identity of the child, because we don't need to know who the child is in order to deliver them an excellent product. Right? We're not encumbered by any other business models like advertising or e-commerce, where we're trying to target and micro profile our consumers. All we're interested in doing is giving them the very best experience from using voice technology. And we don't need to know who they are in order to be able to do that, right? So we can take those steps to ensure that we do not and will never identify the individual kids who are using our platform. Now, clearly, when we're working with partners who are working, for example, in school districts, the school districts, clearly have a legitimate right to be able to hold information about the student record, for example. But from our perspective, all we're providing is data points. The data points, as far as we're concerned, are entirely anonymous, de-identified, and we have no interest or reason to know who the identity of the individual child is. And I think that principle around privacy by design is going to be something that will start to seep into more broader consumer markets, particularly as consumers become more aware of the privacy implications of using technologies, and as we start to see a kind of wider proliferation of independent providers of technologies like voice technology that like us are not encumbered by additional or separate business models. I think the final thing I will say on that is that, in the medium to long term, we see all of this technology going offline anyway, right? So as the capacity of, these edge AI chips increases, as they increase in terms of processing capacity, and as they become embedded into, everyday household objects, you will be able to have the utility of voice interface, whether you're an adult or a child, but none of that data will ever leave your home. And I think that's really going to be a key transformational change in the market.
So just to make sure I understand that last point, is it that right now, right now companies need to rely on, external servers to make computations and then bring something back to the user, while in the future there won't be an internet connection required to get the same effect?
Completely. I mean, well, it's a combination of a requirement for processing power in the cloud, right? So, in order to be able to do the really powerful processing that we do around for example, speech technology, you need access to compute power in order to do that. I think a lot of businesses do that for other reasons in terms of data accumulation, right? But what we're seeing now is that, in particular, these ultra low power edge AI chips that can do neural processing, particularly because they're designed very specifically to process either image or voice, for example, that we can do cloud level computing on these edge AI chips, and they can be embedded into a device. And so therefore, the data never needs to leave the device. You already see some of that happening now on mobile phones, so some of the large technology providers are already doing speech recognition offline on a device, on a mobile phone. The difference is that mobile phone has a pretty expensive, very powerful processor sitting in the middle of it. And what we're talking about is edge AI chips that are kind of smaller than your small fingernail that can go into a device or even a toy, and will be at a price point that it makes sense commercially and economically. And we're not a million miles away from that already. You're already seeing it in things like video doorbells, for example, that don't necessarily need to be connected to the cloud, but can do image recognition at a very simple level. So you're already seeing the nascent emergence of that market, but in the next 3 to 5 years, that's gonna change. I think it will change the way we think about using technologies like speech technology.
Right. So the kind of like the Moore's law effect as applied to voice technology, with the rapid dropping of cost leads to the rapid expansion and the growth of the technology.
Exactly right. And I think, as I said, you will see a transformative change, I think, in terms of the way that people think about the use of that technology when they are reassured that the data, for example, doesn't leave my home, right? So I'm interacting with technology, I'm using my voice, there's a camera, there may be image processing going on as well. So, you can imagine a scenario where a child is walking up to a smart TV, there's a camera that recognizes that it's a child, that the child speaks. The TV is delivering an age-appropriate interface to that child based on the fact that it's a 6-year-old standing in front of it, but none of that data is leaving the device. It's all happening on device.
Yeah, that's right. When you get the full picture, at least more context, as you've described during this conversation, you can see how there's, at least from my perspective, much more promise and just possibilities for more access, more opportunity, as opposed to a, dystopian spy state that we're somehow welcoming into our homes.
Exactly. And I think we've kind of got used to this notion of data accumulation as a compromise when we're accessing technologies like mapping services or even speech technology. But actually, it doesn't need to be that way, and it may well not be that way in the very near future. So let's see how it evolves and develops. And I think that, the broader voice technology market could probably learn a lot from, what we do with kids in terms of respecting the right to privacy. We do it because we think it's the right thing to do. It's ethically the right thing to do. There's also a very strong regulatory framework in place to do it, but there's no reason why that approach cannot be translated into adults. From a utility point of view, you're not losing anything, but you're not having to compromise in terms of your privacy.
Now, excuse me, this could be one you're welcome to pass on. I'm not sure what your policy might be about discussing the partners, but would you be open to giving a couple of suggestions of partners that listeners could check out to see some of your technology in action? I know you mentioned the one language learning app earlier, but is that something you could talk about?
Yeah, Lingumi, I would definitely recommend anybody, particularly if you have young children, to check out Lingumi. And what's really wonderful about the approach that Toby and the team have taken there is they've designed an entire curriculum from the ground up based on this notion that they would be voice enabling it from the very beginning. And I think it's such an engaging and powerful experience and pedagogically sound from a learning and educational perspective, that it's almost like a whole new paradigm for thinking about how we teach language, particularly for young kids, where they may not have access to a native speaker of the language that they're trying to learn. So, it's such a powerful tool. There are some amazing products that we're currently building that I'm absolutely forbidden from talking about, but I can promise you that by September, we'll come back onto the podcast and we can talk about them much more openly. They're exciting products. One is in the education market, another one in the consumer market. And we as a team are really excited to be building them. So watch this space and keep an eye on SoapBoxLabs.com for more news about those.
Sounds good. We'll certainly have you back on to discuss those, maybe with some of your partners for a discussion in that way.
It's a great idea. That sounds like a great idea.
Yeah. Well, Martyn, one of my favorite things is getting to discuss the near future, the things that you can kind of just begin to see the glimmers of and are kind of destined to manifest soon. So you've totally indulged me during this whole conversation on that. So I appreciate you're sharing your expertise and experience around this really fascinating area of education for either entrepreneurs who might be considering or actively trying to create, voice-enabled technology, or educators or parents who just want to learn more. Where would you like to send people to either get in touch with you or to contact your company and learn more?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can go straight to our website, soapboxlabs.com. There's a whole raft of information in there. There's a whole section with almost daily updates in terms of posts and activities that we're involved in. I would also encourage people to follow us on Twitter. We're very active on social media. We not only tweet about ourselves, we tweet about all the interesting things that we're observing in the market, whether it's with voice technology or education, or technology in general, or even funding. There's a whole series of tweets that you can explore. So those are the main tools. You can email us directly at hello@SoapBoxLabs if you want to get in touch directly with us. But certainly, start with the website and move from there.
All right, sounds great, everybody. And you can see that information in the show notes too when the episode is published. So until next time, this has been the EdTech Startup Show. I'm your host, Gerard Dawson, and Martyn, once again, thanks so much for coming on.
It's been my pleasure.